Welcome, dear friends, to our channel. If you find stories of family sacrifice and justice meaningful, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us until the end. These stories are not just entertainment. They're reminders of what love, dignity, and truth mean in our lives. Dad, don't come to my son's birthday. You make people uncomfortable. The words hung in the air heavy and cold, as though someone had cracked the window in mid-January. Max Hayes, 58 years old, stood in his kitchen with the phone pressed to his ear and a carefully wrapped gift resting on the counter beside him. His big, weathered hands that had laid bricks and hoisted beams for nearly 4 decades, rested on the bright paper wrapping. Inside was a toy train set the kind his grandson had been talking about for months. But now Max couldn't even imagine delivering it. He stayed still, as if his boots had been nailed to the linoleum floor. You make people uncomfortable. The phrase repeated itself in his mind, an echo that would not die down. To know Max's story, you must understand where he came from. Max was not a man of wealth or high position. He had been a construction worker all his life, the kind of man who rose before the sun, packed his thermos with black coffee, and left the house with calloused fingers already sore from the day before. His wife Ellen had been the love of his life, the reason he bore the weight of long hours and dangerous work. Together they had built a life on little more than grit, faith, and devotion to their son Daniel. Max had missed vacations and weekends, taken double shifts and side jobs all so Daniel could grow up, never knowing the kind of hunger Max himself had known as a boy. He'd sold his fishing boat when college tuition came due. He'd emptied his small retirement savings when Daniel and Jenna struggled with medical bills during the birth of their first child. Every nail Max drove into someone else's house, every drop of sweat he left on the job site, was at least in his mind for his family. For Daniel, for the future. And yet, here he was. Alone. Standing beside a wrapped toy train he might never get to see his grandson open. The silence on the phone line stretched too long. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat and added softer, but less firm. It's better this way, Dad. The guests, they just don't get you. We'll talk later. The line went dead. Max set the phone down gently, almost reverently, as though it were some fragile artifact from a museum. Then he pulled out a chair and sat heavily at the kitchen table. Around him, the house felt cavernous, though it was small by any measure. Since Ellen's death 3 years before, the rooms had grown quieter, the evenings longer. He still kept her photograph on the mantel, a smiling woman with kind eyes and auburn hair pinned back neatly. In moments like this, he almost expected her to speak some gentle word of comfort, some reminder to keep faith. Instead, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. Max ran his fingers over the creased skin of his palms, remembering the long years when those hands could build anything, fix anything, provide anything. How strange that they could build a home, but could not keep him from being unwelcome in it. He glanced at the toy train again, its glossy wrapping reflect the weak kitchen light. He had chosen it carefully, remembering how Daniel himself once begged for one when he was 8 years old. Back then, Max had worked Saturdays for 6 months just to afford it. Daniel had loved that train. Now Daniel was the one saying, "You make people uncomfortable." Max leaned back in his chair, his chest heavy with something between heartbreak and disbelief. He whispered to the photograph on the mantel, "Did we really raise him for this?" Ellen, outside, the November wind rattled the loose shutters. Inside, Max sat alone at the table that once hosted birthday cakes, Thanksgiving turkeys, and Christmas hams. A table where laughter once lived, now bare, except for a wrapped gift no one wanted. And in that moment, beneath the hum of the refrigerator and the ache of silence, something in Max cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but like a beam beneath the floorboards, finally splintering after years of wait. He had given everything. Now it seemed he was nothing but an embarrassment. The gift still sat on the table, bright paper, mocking the gloom of the kitchen. Max pushed it aside, leaned forward, and buried his face in his rough palms. For a long while, he just breathed slow, heavy breaths that carried years of exhaustion. His thoughts drifted back to another birthday long ago when Daniel was no older than his grandson now. Max could still see the scene with painful clarity, the kitchen smelling of chocolate cake, Ellen wearing her apron dusted with flour, and Daniel bouncing up and down on his chair, eyes sparkling at the sight of the toy truck Max had saved for months to buy. That truck had cost nearly a week's wages back then. The Hayes family hadn't had much, but Ellen had insisted birthdays were sacred. Even if it's just one gift, Max, she used to say, make sure it's one that tells him how much he's loved. And Max had followed her word as though it were gospel. He remembered stumbling in from a double shift at the construction site, boots heavy with cement dust, shoulders aching, and still staying up half the night to fix the toy's squeaky wheels before Daniel opened it. When the boy had thrown his arms around him, shouting, "Thanks, Dad," Max felt like the richest man alive. Now, decades later, the toy train meant for Daniel's son lay unopened, and Max sat alone in a chair Ellen once used to stitch torn sleeves and hem pant legs. The memory of Ellen filled the room, as if she had just walked in carrying that quiet strength she always had. She was gone 3 years now. Cancer had taken her in slow, cruel steps, but in moments like this, Max still caught himself waiting for her to hum, as she folded laundry or pour him a glass of iced tea after a long day in the heat. "You're not just a worker, Max," she used to tell him. "You're the heart of this family." Yet the very family he built with her now turned its face away. Max rose from the table and wandered to the living room. On the mantel above the fireplace stood photographs that traced the history of their small world. Ellen on their wedding day, hair pinned with wildflowers. Daniel as a boy, front teeth missing, holding up a baseball glove too big for his hand. The three of them together, smiling in front of the old pickup truck that had carried them on countless road trips. Max picked up one frame, a picture of Daniel on his college graduation day. The young man in the cap and gown stood proudly, but just out of frame was Max, who had worked nights for 2 years straight to cover tuition after scholarships fell short. Max had driven home from those shifts half asleep, eaten cold leftovers in silence, so Daniel could have fresh meals packed for campus, and gone to bed only when Ellen begged him to rest. Daniel never knew all of it. Ellen used to say, "Don't burden him with the details. That's what parents are for." And Max agreed. Parents carried weight so their children could walk lighter. But tonight that weight pressed down like iron chains. He walked back to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat again at the empty table. Outside, the neighborhood houses glowed with live cars and driveways, lights strung early for the holidays, shadows of families moving across curtains. Inside his own house, there was only silence. Max stared at the empty chair across from him, the one he had hoped his grandson would fill. In his mind's eye, he could see the boy there, giggling as the train looped around the track, calling out Grandpa, "Look," instead. That chair stayed cold, untouched, like a reminder carved into wood, "You're not welcome." Max reached for Ellen's photograph again, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You always said not to give so much that they forget to be grateful. Maybe I should have listened." The toy train gleamed under the kitchen light untouched. For the first time in his life, Max wondered if giving had been his mistake all along. The phone rang just as Max was about to turn in for the night. The sudden sound cut through the silence of the old house, startling him so badly he nearly dropped Ellen's photograph from his hand. He shuffled to the kitchen counter where the cordless phone still sat in its cradle. For a moment, he let it ring, his heart pounding with the small, irrational hope that maybe, just maybe, it was Daniel calling back saying he'd changed his mind. But when he finally pressed the receiver to his ear, it wasn't his son's voice. "Dad, it's Jenna." His daughter-in-law's tone was smooth, polite on the surface, but sharpened underneath. Max braced himself instinctively, the way one does before walking into a cold wind. "I just wanted to make sure you understood about tomorrow," she said. "We'll be at my parents' place all afternoon. It'll be crowded, you know, and well, it's just better this way." Her words came wrapped in diplomacy, but Max heard what they really meant: "You don't belong." "I understand," he said quietly. There was a pause on the line, the faint noise of laughter and clinking dishes in the background. Jenna lowered her voice. "Look, Max, you've done a lot for Daniel, for all of us. But sometimes it's best to step aside and let us handle things our way. We don't want people feeling uncomfortable, that's all." Uncomfortable. The word lodged in his chest like a shard of glass. He wanted to ask, since when did my presence make my own family uncomfortable? Was it the calluses on my hands, the wrinkles on my face, the smell of sweat from decades of work that paid for their roof? But instead, Max swallowed hard and said, "I see." Jenna seemed relieved. "Thanks for understanding. Enjoy your evening, Max." Happy birthday, too. She stopped herself, as if remembering he wouldn't be there to celebrate his grandson at all. Anyway, take care. The line clicked dead. Max lowered the receiver slowly, the silence of the house rushing back in. He leaned against the counter, staring at the blinking light on the microwave clock. 9:17. He thought of his grandson, a boy who still ran to him with open arms whenever they crossed paths, shouting "Grandpa," with unfiltered joy. The boy didn't know about family politics, about shame, about the invisible lines adults drew to keep people out. He only knew love. But tomorrow the boy would blow out candles without his grandfather there. Tomorrow he'd never know that a gift carefully chosen, lovingly wrapped, sat waiting in an empty house just a few streets away. Max walked back to the living room, the wooden floor creaking beneath his steps. He sat in Ellen's old recliner, sinking into the worn cushions that still seemed to carry her shape. For years she had been his balance, the one who softened his temper, who reminded him to look at the bigger picture, who insisted that Daniel's happiness was worth every sacrifice. "Don't give so much that he forgets to say thank you," she had once whispered on a late night, her hand warm on his arm. Max hadn't listened. He had given everything. And now he was here alone with nothing but shadows for company. He closed his eyes, but instead of sleep, memories came rushing in, carrying Daniel on his shoulders through the state fair, working overtime to cover his college books, standing proud at his wedding, even though he couldn't afford a proper suit. He had always believed that love shown in action was louder than words. But words were what echoed in his ears tonight. "Dad, don't come. You make people uncomfortable." The shame of it pressed down harder than any beam he had ever hoisted at a construction site. Max sat for hours in the dim light until the house grew so still he could hear his own heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car door slammed. Life went on around him, but inside time had frozen on those cruel words. He rose at last, walked to the mantel, and whispered to Ellen's photo. "Maybe I've been too quiet too long. Maybe it's time I stopped letting them decide my worth." The picture seemed to watch him, silent, patient. Max didn't know yet what that meant, but a seed had been planted. The next morning, Thanksgiving sunlight poured weakly through the thin curtains in Max's kitchen. The day should have been filled with the warmth of laughter, clinking glasses, and the steady hum of family voices. Instead, the house was still heavy like a church after the last hymn has faded. Max sat at the edge of the table he had set the night before. The roasted turkey he'd carefully prepared, golden and fragrant, still sat in the center untouched. Stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, all the traditional dishes he had once made with Ellen, waited like loyal soldiers with no one to serve. The empty chairs seemed to mock him, especially the one across from him where Daniel used to sit as a boy, legs too short to reach the floor, swaying while he gobbled down drumsticks. Max picked up his fork, but his hand trembled, the silver clinking against the plate. He tried to eat, but every bite tasted of ash. His eyes drifted to the wrapped present sitting on the sideboard. The bright paper and ribbon he had tied last night seemed almost ridiculous now, a splash of cheer in a room drenched with absence. Inside the box was a small wooden train set he had built with his own hands in the garage, each car carefully sanded, painted, and connected with tiny brass hooks. A gift for his grandson, something he hoped the boy would treasure the way Daniel once treasured the handmade toys Max crafted when money was scarce. But the boy would never see it. Not today. The house creaked as if reminding him he wasn't completely alone. The old clock ticked steadily on the mantel, Ellen's photograph beside it. He stared at her smile, frozen forever in that frame, and imagined what she would say if she could see him now. "You can't keep letting them hurt you, Max," he whispered, almost hearing her voice answering back. "You gave them everything, but you don't have to let them take all of you." The thought settled deep inside him, heavier than the turkey, sharper than the cranberry's bite. Around noon, the sound of children's laughter carried faintly from down the block. Neighbors celebrating, families gathering. Max imagined Daniel and Jenna at her parents' house, long table filled with food decorations strung bright across the room. Everyone smiling. He could picture Jenna's parents clapping Daniel on the back, praising their family man while Max's chair remained empty. The image stung. He rose from the table and walked slowly through the house. His boots echoed against the wood floors he had laid himself all those years ago. Every room carried memories: Daniel's first steps in the hallway, Ellen humming in the kitchen, Christmas mornings filled with wrapping paper chaos. The walls whispered stories of devotion, sacrifice, and time. Max ended up in his study, where he kept a battered wooden desk. The drawers groaned as he pulled them open, shuffling through papers until he found the old folder Ellen had always insisted he keep. Inside, receipts, mortgage papers, hospital bills, tuition slips, grocery statements. Decades of proof. Each one a fragment of a life built on giving. He spread them out across the desk, his eyes scanning the numbers. $150 zero for Daniel and Jenna's medical bills when their son was born. $30 zero for Daniel's car loan. $48 zero for college tuition. Countless smaller amounts: groceries, utilities, emergencies. Every figure was a reminder I was there when they needed me. Every time. And now they couldn't stand the sight of him. The shame and grief that had filled him the night before began to shift into something colder, steadier. Resolve. Max leaned back in his chair, staring at Ellen's picture, his voice steady for the first time in days. They think I'm just a burden, Ellen. But maybe it's time I show them what a burden really looks like when it finally walks away. The room was silent, except for the tick of the clock. But Max knew deep in his bones that a line had been crossed. This Thanksgiving, the turkey might go untouched. The gift might remain unopened. But something had changed inside him. The shadow of loneliness was giving way to something sharper, something dangerous, the beginning of a plan. The day after Thanksgiving, Max drove his old pickup through the quiet streets of Denver, the turkey leftovers still sitting untouched in his fridge. The world seemed to move on while he remained stuck in the heaviness of yesterday. The sidewalks bustled with families carrying shopping bags. Black Friday, people called it, yet Max's own house still carried the silence of abandonment. He wasn't sure why he turned toward his sister Rosa's house. Maybe it was instinct, maybe just muscle memory from years of dropping by when Ellen was still alive. Rosa was only a year younger than him, her life a patchwork of its own struggles, divorce, raising 2 kids, working late shifts as a nurse. But she had something Max desperately needed right now, someone who still saw him as family. Her small brick house was warm, golden light spilling through the curtains. When she opened the door, still in her scrubs, her eyes widened at the sight of him. "Max, you didn't call. Come in." He stepped inside, the smell of coffee wrapping around him. Rosa motioned toward the couch. "You look like you've carried the world on your shoulders all night." Max sat heavily, hands clasped between his knees. For a moment, he wasn't sure how to begin. But then the words tumbled out. They didn't come, Rosa. Daniel and Jenna. Thanksgiving dinner. Not a call, not a visit, just a text. Rosa's face hardened, a crease forming between her brows. What did it say? Max swallowed the shame still raw. That they were spending it with her family. That I'd ruined the vibe. Rosa gasped softly, covering her mouth. He said that your own son, he nodded. His voice was low, flat. I had the table set, Rosa. Turkey, stuffing, everything. I even built a toy train set for my grandson, still sitting in its wrapping paper. And I sat there staring at empty chairs. For a moment, Rosa didn't say anything. Her silence was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of judgment. It was the silence of someone struggling to contain anger. Max, she finally said, her tone sharp, you have given Daniel everything. You worked 2 jobs so he could go to college. You paid their hospital bills when their boy was born. You even covered that ridiculous car repair last year. And now they tell you you're an embarrassment. Max rubbed his eyes with calloused hands. Maybe I've spoiled him too much. Maybe Ellen was right. I gave and gave until he forgot how to be grateful. Rosa leaned forward, her voice fierce. No, don't you dare blame yourself for their cruelty. This isn't about gratitude anymore. It's about respect. And they've lost it. The words landed like stones in his chest. Respect. That was it. More than the empty table, more than the ignored turkey, more than the unopened gift, it was the loss of respect that had gutted him. Max looked up, his eyes meeting his sister's. What do you do, Rosa, when your own flesh and blood treats you like a burden? She reached across, squeezing his hand. You stop letting them walk all over you. You stand up, Max. You remind them who you are. He sat back, Rosa's words echoing through him. Remind them who you are. He had spent so many years burying his own needs beneath the weight of theirs. Maybe it was time to stop. I don't know how, he admitted. Rosa gave him a long, steady look. Then start small. Start by refusing to carry their load anymore. And Max, when the time is right, you make sure they see it. Not just Daniel. Not just Jenna. Everyone. Max's breath caught. Everyone. The thought lit something inside him. A revenge not whispered in private, but revealed in public, undeniable. He rose from the couch, suddenly restless. Thanks, Rosa, for listening. She stood too, her nurse's fatigue softened by the warmth in her eyes. You don't have to fight this alone, Max. Remember that. As he stepped back into the cool night, the city lights blinking against the dark sky, Max felt the first outlines of a plan forming. No more empty chairs. No more waiting for gratitude that would never come. The next holiday wouldn't be like this. He would make sure of it. The night after speaking with Rosa, Max couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to its slow, steady whir. Rosa's words replayed in his head, remind them who you are. Make sure they see it. Sometime past midnight, he rose from bed and padded into the kitchen. The air was cold, carrying the faint smell of roasted turkey that had gone uneaten. On the table, the unopened toy train set sat under a thin layer of dust, a mocking reminder of who hadn't shown up. Max pulled a chair out and sat down heavily. His gaze drifted to the drawer by the refrigerator, the one Ellen always told him to keep organized. Because someday, Max, you'll need those papers, she used to say with a gentle smile. With a sigh, he opened it. Inside lay years of receipts, folded bank statements, hospital bills, mortgage stubs. His whole life of sacrifice documented in ink and faded paper. Max began pulling them out one by one, stacking them on the table like evidence in a trial. The first pile, hospital bills. $48 for Daniel's surgery after the car accident at 19. Max had worked 16-hour shifts back then, taking every construction job he could get, his knees aching from climbing scaffolds long after the other men went home. The second pile, college tuition. 4 years at the University of Colorado. Nearly $120 when all was said and done. He remembered Ellen massaging his shoulders while he filled out late-night loan applications, whispering she'll thank you one day. The third pile, mortgage payments. Not just his own. Daniel's first house had nearly slipped into foreclosure when he lost his job for a year. Max had quietly stepped in, paying 12 months straight, so his son's family wouldn't end up homeless. Each canceled check was a scar on his savings, but he told himself it was worth it. He sat back, staring at the growing mountain of paper. Each page was more than money. Each page was another piece of his life, his sweat, his bones, his youth converted into numbers for his son's future. Max rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all. For decades he had been the safety net, the quiet force that kept everyone afloat. But no one remembered. No one respected. A bitter laugh escaped his throat. And now I'm told not to come to a birthday. Because I make people uncomfortable. The stack of papers blurred before his eyes as tears welled up hot and unrelenting. He let them fall. This time his body shaking as he finally allowed himself to feel the betrayal fully. After a long while, Max wiped his face and took a deep breath. Slowly, methodically, he gathered the papers and placed them into a leather binder Ellen had once bought for him. She'd wanted him to use it for important documents, but Max had always shrugged it off. Tonight it felt almost prophetic. He slid the binder closed, pressing down hard, as if sealing away years of pain. When he looked at it sitting there on the table, he didn't just see paper. He saw a weapon. Not a weapon of violence, but of truth. Max whispered aloud into the quiet room, as if Ellen were still listening. They think I'm just an old man with nothing left. But these papers, this is my story. And one day, Rosa's right, they're going to see it. He placed the binder neatly in the center of the table, the candlelight flickering across its dark cover. For the first time in weeks, his heartbeat steadied. This wasn't the end of his story. This was the beginning of something else. Max turned off the light, and walked back to bed with a strange calm filling his chest. The binder remained on the table waiting. It wasn't just a record of the past. It was the foundation of his revenge. The next afternoon, just as the sun began to dip and cast long golden streaks across the street, Max heard a gentle knock on his door. He hesitated. He wasn't expecting anyone. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but the knocking came again, followed by a familiar voice. "Max, it's me, Mrs. Henderson." He sighed and pushed himself up from his recliner. Mrs. Henderson had been his neighbor for nearly 20 years, a retired schoolteacher with a sharp wit and kind eyes. Ellen had adored her, always saying she was the sort of neighbor every family prayed for. When Max opened the door, she stood there bundled in a wool coat, holding a pie dish wrapped in foil. The scent of cinnamon and apples drifted toward him. "I baked too much again," she said with a small smile. "And I thought you might like a little company." Max swallowed hard. He almost said no. He almost told her he wasn't in the mood. But her expression was too kind, too knowing. He stepped aside. "Come in, then. It smells good already." She entered, her gaze sweeping across the dimly lit room. On the dining table sat the binder of documents he had assembled the night before, its leather cover reflecting the last light of day. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lingered on it, but she said nothing. Instead, she set the pie down and pulled off her gloves. "So," she said gently, "did Daniel and Jenna bring the little one by for Thanksgiving?" Max froze, his jaw tightening. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "They had other plans." Mrs. Henderson tilted her head, the corners of her mouth tightening. She had raised children of her own, and she knew the sting of neglect when she saw it in someone else's eyes. She reached across the table, patting his hand. "Max, you've given so much to that boy. Everyone on this street knows it. You worked yourself to the bone, built that house with your own hands, made sure he never wanted for anything. It's a shame he doesn't see it." Her words cracked something in him. Max didn't mean to, but suddenly the truth tumbled out, the phone call that told him not to come, the years of sacrifices, the empty chair at the table. When he finished, Mrs. Henderson sat back in her chair, her eyes sharp now, her voice steadier than before. "Then you need to stop letting them write the story. You've got the evidence of everything you've done for them, don't you?" She gestured at the binder on the table. Max looked at it, then back at her. "I kept everything. Receipts. Statements. Every sacrifice I ever made. But what good is it sitting in a folder?" Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, lowering her voice, as though sharing a secret. "It's good when people see it, Max. Not just your son. Everyone. You think you're alone, but you're not. You've got neighbors, friends, people from church, who know the truth. You just have to remind them." Her words hung in the air, sharp and bright as candlelight. For the first time, Max saw the binder differently. Not just as his record, but as a story waiting to be told. A story that could restore his dignity in the eyes of others. Mrs. Henderson rose after a while, pressing the warm pie into his hands. "You eat this, Max. And you remember you're not invisible. Not to me. Not to anyone who really matters." After she left, Max set the pie aside and stared again at the binder. He placed his hands on its cover, feeling its weight. Rosa had told him to make them see. Now Mrs. Henderson had unknowingly confirmed it. He whispered to himself, "They're going to see everything. All of it." Outside, the evening deepened, the first hints of frost forming on the windows. Inside, for the first time since Thanksgiving, Max felt something stir in his chest. That wasn't despair. It was purpose. The following weekend, Max heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside his house. He pulled the curtain aside and saw a familiar blue sedan pulling into the driveway. His heart gave a little start. Rosa, his younger sister, stepped out, her short frame bundled in a heavy winter coat, a scarf looped tightly around her neck. She carried a grocery bag in one arm and waved with the other. "Max," she called, her voice carrying the same mixture of warmth and worry it always had. He opened the door before she could knock, and the smell of coffee beans and fresh bread spilled in with her. "I brought provisions," Rosa said with a smile, "because if I know you, you've been living on canned soup again." He chuckled, though she wasn't wrong. "You sound like Ellen." At the mention of his late wife, Rosa's smile softened. She hugged him firmly, and for a moment Max felt a pang of longing for family, for closeness, for the kind of love he used to take for granted. Inside, Rosa unpacked groceries onto the kitchen counter: eggs, fresh vegetables, a loaf of sourdough. She moved through the kitchen as if she'd lived there herself, talking over her shoulder. "So, tell me, did Daniel and Jenna finally show up for Thanksgiving? Or did they pull the same stunt again?" Max's silence answered for him. Rosa turned, reading his face. Her lips pressed into a hard line. "They didn't come." "No," Max said. "They told me not to." Rosa blinked, stunned. "They told you not to?" His voice cracked as he repeated the words that had burned into him. "Dad don't come. You'll just ruin the vibe." For a long moment, Rosa didn't speak. Then slowly she sat down at the table across from him, her hands flat against the wood. "Max, they've forgotten who you are." He swallowed. Maybe they never really knew. But Rosa wasn't finished. Her eyes, dark, fierce, locked on his. "Do you remember when you worked those triple shifts so Daniel could go to college debt-free? Do you remember selling Dad's old land so you could pay his mortgage when he and Jenna got in over their heads? You carried that boy on your back his whole life. And now he has the nerve to erase you." Max reached for the binder on the table, sliding it toward her. She opened it and leafed through the pages: tuition payments, mortgage stubs, credit card statements, all signed by Max. Her jaw tightened. "Good. You kept everything. You always were the detail man." She looked up at him, her eyes flashing. "So here's what you do. You stop sitting here waiting for them to invite you back into their lives. You show them. You show everyone what you've done. You drag their betrayal into the light where no one can deny it." Max leaned back, exhaling. "Mrs. Henderson said the same thing last week, that it's not just about me and them. It's about letting others see the truth." Rosa nodded, her face set. "Exactly. People need to know. Not for revenge, though God knows they deserve it, but for your dignity. For the years you gave. And you know what, maybe for that little boy too? He should grow up knowing who his real grandfather is." The mention of his grandson sent a sharp pang through Max. He had hardly seen the child Jenna, always making excuses. The thought of the boy one day being told his grandfather was useless filled him with rage. "I won't let them rewrite me," Max whispered. Rosa placed her hand over his. "Then don't. You've got allies, Max." "Me." "Mrs. Henderson. Pastor John if you want him. You're not alone. And when the time comes, we'll be right there beside you." Max stared at her, the beginnings of a plan forming in his mind. A Thanksgiving had just passed in silence, but maybe the next holiday wouldn't end the same way. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a discarded old man. He felt like a man sharpening his resolve. 2 days after Rosa's visit, Max woke early, brewed a pot of black coffee, and sat staring at the binder of papers spread across his kitchen table. The morning light slanted through the blinds, catching the edges of the receipts like they were holy relics, proof of a life spent giving, proof that he had not imagined his sacrifices. He tapped his calloused fingers on the table one after another until he finally picked up the phone. The first number he dialed was Pastor John. "Max," the familiar voice boomed after 2 rings. "Haven't heard from you in a while?" "Everything okay?" Max hesitated, his throat tightening. "Not really, John. I need someone to listen. And maybe someone to stand beside me." There was a pause, then the pastor's steady reply: "You name the time." "I'll be there." That afternoon, Pastor John sat across from Max at the kitchen table, his eyes moving over the piles of bills, the mortgage stubs, the tuition receipts. He whistled softly. "You paid for all of this, every cent," Max said quietly. "And now I'm told I'm a burden. Told I'm not welcome at my own grandson's birthday, at Thanksgiving, at Christmas. John, I won't be erased like that." Pastor John closed the binder, his expression grave. "Max, you have every right to feel betrayed. But you also have every right to make the truth known. If you want, I'll stand with you when that day comes." The words were like bricks laid into the foundation of a plan. The next evening, Rosa returned carrying her usual bag of groceries and her sharp tongue. But this time, Max didn't just listen. He spoke. "I'm done letting them write the story," he said. "I want others to see what I gave and what they've become." "Will you be there if I call for it?" Rosa's eyes narrowed, then softened. "Max, I'll be there in the front row, clapping louder than anyone when the truth comes out." Later that week, Max walked down the block to Mrs. Henderson's house. She greeted him with her usual gentle smile, her hands dusted with flour from baking. "Max, come in. I've just pulled a pie out of the oven." But Max shook his head. "Not today, Helen. I need to ask you something important." She led him to the porch where they sat in the chill of the late afternoon. Max explained everything: the phone calls, the empty chairs, the binder full of sacrifices. When he finished, Mrs. Henderson's lips trembled with quiet fury. "Max, I've lived next door for 30 years. I saw you leave before sunrise to work double shifts. I saw Ellen bring you dinner in the garage while you built furniture for your daughter's room. Don't you worry. If you want witnesses, you've got them. I'll be there." Max exhaled, something loosening in his chest. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of betrayal lifting, not because the pain was gone, but because he was no longer carrying it alone. That night, he opened his notebook and began writing names. Rosa, Pastor John, Mrs. Henderson, maybe even a few of his old work buddies from the construction site who'd seen firsthand the lengths he went to for his family. He tapped the pen against the page, staring at the growing list. These weren't just names. They were allies. They were people who would stand with him when the moment came, not just to watch, but to bear witness. Max leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. The betrayal had been private. But the reckoning, that would be public. The next morning, Max pulled an old leather satchel from the top shelf of his closet. Ellen had given it to him 30 years ago when he first became a foreman on the construction site. Back then, it had carried blueprints and work orders. Today, it would carry something far more powerful: the receipts of a life given page by page. He spread everything out across his kitchen table. Bills, contracts, bank slips, and even birthday invoices, all the times he had said yes when life demanded more of him. The table looked like a battlefield strewn with proof of every sacrifice he had made. Max began with the mortgage statements. He pulled the yellowing slips from the folder, each stamped paid. He stacked them neatly, one on top of another, until the pile was thick enough to weigh down the corner of the binder. Next came the tuition receipts. The University of Colorado, 4 years, $48,000. He ran his fingers along the faded ink, remembering the nights he had come home with concrete dust in his hair, aching from double shifts, but still managed to sit at the table helping his son with homework. He had told himself then that sacrifice was temporary, but the reward would be permanent. He added the wedding expenses. $32,000 for a single day of rented tuxedos, floral arches, and champagne. He remembered his daughter's tears, her pleading for a dream wedding. He'd worked weekends on hardwood floors to make it happen, sweat dripping into the sawdust while she smiled in bridal magazines. She had whispered, "Daddy, you're the best," as they danced that night. And now, she called him a burden. Finally, Max included the bills from Jeremy the car, repairs, the utilities, the steakhouse dinners, disguised as celebrations. Every page he slid into the binder was another weight on the scale tipping against them. When he finished, the binder bulged so full it barely closed. He snapped the metal ring shut and held it in his hands, heavy and solid, like a weapon forged not of steel, but of memory and sacrifice. Rosa came by later that evening and found him at the table, the binder in front of him like a Bible. "What's all this?" she asked. Max opened it to the first page and slid it across the table. Rosa read silently for a long time, her expression shifting from surprise to anger to quiet awe. "You've kept everything," she whispered. "I kept it because Ellen told me once, don't ever throw away proof of love, Max. One day you might need it." He paused, eyes clouding. "I didn't know she meant this day." Rosa turned the page. "Max, This isn't just paperwork. This is your story. You show this to people and they'll know the truth. They'll see what kind of man you are. That's the idea, Max said grimly. When the time comes, I'll lay it all out. Every bill, every receipt, every cent I bled for them. Let the world judge who the real burden is. That night, Max carried the binder into the living room and set it on the mantel beneath Ellen's photograph. He stared at her smile the way her eyes had always held both kindness and warning. I'm ready now, he whispered. I'm not just a man they can discard. I'm the man who built their lives. And they're about to remember it. As the grandfather clock ticked into the silence, Max sat back, his hand resting on the binder. It was more than paper. It was his shield, his sword, and soon his voice. For years, his sacrifices had gone unnoticed. But not anymore. The next morning, Max rose earlier than usual. The binder sat on his kitchen counter, heavy as a stone, waiting. He poured himself black coffee, his hands steady now, not trembling like before. The plan had taken shape in his mind overnight, and it was time to act. For years, he had been the man who waited by the phone for invitations to birthdays, to Christmas dinners, to graduations that never included him. But not this time. This time, he would be the one extending the invitation. Max picked up the old landline phone. He dialed Rosa first. Rosa, he said, his voice low, but certain, I'm hosting Thanksgiving dinner this year. At my house. There was silence on the line before Rosa replied, cautious. Max, are you sure after the way they've treated you? I'm more than sure, he said. I need witnesses. I need people who've seen me, who know the truth. And I need you to be there when the time comes. She hesitated only a moment before answering. Then I'll be there, Max. You won't stand alone. Next, he called Mrs. Henderson, the widow from next door, who had always brought over pies and casseroles when Ellen passed. Mrs. Henderson, Max said warmly, would you do me the honor of joining me for dinner this Thanksgiving? I'm planning a real gathering this time. Oh, Max, she said, her voice lifting. I thought you'd never ask. It's been too long since that house of yours had company. I'll bring my pumpkin bread. Her acceptance gave Max an odd mix of comfort and resolve. He was no longer invisible. Then came Pastor John, the man who had presided over Ellen's funeral, and checked in now and then, always reminding Max he had a church family. Pastor Max said, I'd like you to come to my table this year. Thanksgiving dinner at my place. I've got something I need to share with everyone. Pastor John's deep voice hummed on the other end. Max, you sound like a man with a burden on his heart. If you need me, I'll be there. By afternoon, Max had made half a dozen calls. A few old co-workers, the Pattersons down the street, even his doctor, who had once treated him like family when Ellen was sick. Each one agreed. The table that had so often been set for ghosts would be alive with conversation this year. But the most important call came last. His son. Max dialed slowly, each number a wait. When his son answered, cheerful and distracted, Max spoke plainly. Son, I'm hosting Thanksgiving dinner at the house this year. I want you, Jenna, and the kids here. 6 o'clock. There was a pause, and then a scoff. Dad, we already told you we're going to Jenna's parents. It's tradition. Max's jaw tightened. No, he said evenly. Tradition was built here. In this house. With this family. You will come. One last time. On the other end, silence stretched thin. Then his son muttered, fine. We'll stop by. But don't make this weird, Dad. Max hung up without another word. He didn't need to make it weird. The truth itself would do the job. That evening, Max set the dining table, laying out Ellen's china and polishing the silverware. The glow of the candles flickered against the binder now resting at the head of the table where he would sit. It looked less like paperwork and more like a judge's gavel waiting to fall. For the first time in years, the house felt alive, not with dread but with purpose. This Thanksgiving wouldn't be about turkey or cranberry sauce. It would be about truth, and Max was ready to serve it hot. Thanksgiving Day dawned cold with a thin crust of frost clinging to the rooftops of Max's quiet neighborhood. By late afternoon, the savory smell of roasted turkey and spiced sweet potatoes filled his home, mingling with the faint scent of pine from the wreath Ellen had hung every November for decades. The table stretched long across the dining room, dressed in a white cloth that Ellen had embroidered years ago. Each plate was set with care, each wine glass catching the amber light of the candles. And at the head of the table sat the binder, its black leather cover sharp against the softness of the festive decor. Guests began to arrive as the sun dipped low. Rosa was the first, carrying 2 pumpkin pies, her eyes scanning Max's face. She hugged him tightly. "You look steady," she whispered. "Like you've already decided what comes next." Max only nodded, guiding her inside. Soon after, Mrs. Henderson arrived, smiling as she handed over her famous pumpkin bread. Pastor John followed, his deep laugh booming as he greeted familiar faces. One by one, neighbors and friends filled the house until the air was buzzing with conversation and warmth. For the first time in years, the dining room glowed with life. Yet at the far end of the table, one chair remained noticeably empty. Max's eyes kept drifting to it. It was the chair meant for his son. He'd placed it deliberately opposite his own, so that when the moment came, there would be no hiding. At 6:20, the front door finally creaked open. His son walked in, first, coat slung carelessly over one shoulder, phone still in his hand. Jenna trailed behind, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, her eyes scanning the room with visible disapproval at the crowd of neighbors and outsiders. "Dad," his son said flatly, "you didn't say you were inviting half the block." "I invited my family, Max," replied, his tone calm but edged. "And these people, they've stood by me when others turned away." Jenna forced a smile, setting a store-bought dessert on the counter with a thud. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Their 2 children, restless from the long car ride, dashed into the living room, ignoring the greetings of Rosa and Mrs. Henderson. The atmosphere shifted. The warmth that had filled the room cooled tension, sliding in like a draft under the door. The chatter died down as people noticed the brittle distance between Max and his son. Dinner began anyway. Plates filled with turkey stuffing and casseroles were passed around. Laughter resumed in cautious spurts, and Pastor John led a blessing that steadied the room. But Max's son sat slouched, scrolling his phone under the table, Jenna whispering in his ear from time to time, her smirk cutting like glass. And still the chair across from Max stayed empty. His son had pulled it back, but never truly sat in it. He hovered at the edge, present in body, but absent in spirit, a living reminder of the distance between them. Mrs. Henderson noticed. She leaned toward Max, her voice low. "That chair looks lonelier than you did last Christmas." Max's jaw tightened. He had felt that loneliness for years, but tonight he wasn't the only one who would see it. As dessert plates were cleared, a hush began to settle over the room. Max placed his hands on the binder, fingers tracing its worn edge. The sight of that empty chair across from him filled him not with despair but with clarity. "Before we end the evening," Max said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "there's something I need to share." Every head turned toward him. Rosa's eyes widened. Pastor John folded his hands. Even Jenna set down her wineglass, her smirk faltering. Max looked once more at the chair, the symbol of absence, betrayal, and denial, and then back at the faces around the table. "For years," he began, "I filled this chair with hope. Hope that family would honor sacrifice. Hope that love would be enough. Tonight, I stopped waiting." The room went still. The truth was about to surface, and the empty chair was no longer just furniture. It was evidence, and Max was ready to make it speak louder than words. The dining room had gone quiet, save for the faint crackle of candle flames and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Max remained standing, one hand resting on the black binder at the head of the table. His guests, neighbors, Rosa, Mrs. Henderson, Pastor John, looked at him with expectation. His son glanced up from his phone, puzzled, while Jenna's polished smile flickered into unease. "I've been thinking," Max began, his voice steady, almost conversational. "Every Thanksgiving we gather to give thanks. But what happens when gratitude is missing, when love turns into entitlement?" He opened the binder, slowly, the leather creaking in the silence. Inside plastic sleeves held document after document, bank statements, mortgage receipts, utility bills. The weight of decades sat in those pages. He pulled out the first one and held it up. This, he said, is the mortgage statement from 2002. I worked double shifts pouring concrete through a Colorado winter so my son would have a roof over his head. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from weakness, but from memory. He laid it on the table, face up where everyone could see the numbers in black ink. He drew out another. Here's the tuition check. 4 years of college. $48,000. I was on job sites when most fathers were home for dinner. I ate cold sandwiches under half-built bridges so he could sit in lecture halls and dream big. Rosa dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Mrs. Henderson shook her head, muttering softly. My Lord Max's son shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Dad, is this really necessary? Oh, it's necessary, Max replied, his gaze fixed on him. Because you told me I was no longer welcome at Thanksgiving. That I ruined the vibe. His voice cracked with the sting of betrayal. So tonight, I want everyone to know exactly what I gave and exactly what I got in return. Gasps rippled through the guests. Pastor John leaned forward, brow furrowed as if preparing to intervene. But Max pressed on, page after page spilling onto the table. The car loan I co-signed. The down payment on the house you live in. The hospital bill when Jenna gave birth, $150,000. Paid in full by me. He slapped the statement down, the sharp sound echoing like a gavel strike. Jenna's face flushed crimson. She reached for her wine, then set it down with shaking hands. His son's jaw clenched, the mask of indifference slipping. Max's eyes burned, but he held himself tall. And yet when the holidays come, when family should mean the most, you choose to leave me with an empty chair. The room was utterly still. Even the children, sensing the storm in their grandfather's voice, had frozen mid-play. Max closed the binder with finality, the sound like a door slamming shut. He rested both hands on the cover, shoulders squared. I don't say this to shame you privately. I say it here among friends, neighbors, the people who know me, because you need to understand what you've thrown away. His son stood abruptly, palms flat on the table. Dad, stop, you're making a scene. A scene? Max's eyes flashed. No, son. This is the truth. And sometimes the truth doesn't whisper, it roars. The air trembled with his words. Across the table, Rosa's voice broke the silence. Max, you have every right. Others murmured agreement. Mrs. Henderson reached across and touched his hand, tears in her eyes. For the first time in years, Max didn't feel small or silenced. He felt seen. He looked back at his son and Jenna, who now sat frozen, their carefully constructed image cracking before the eyes of everyone they'd hoped to impress. You called me a burden, Max said softly, his voice no longer angry but cutting in its calmness. Well, tonight you carry the weight of your own choices. And with that, he slid the binder to the center of the table where every guest could see the evidence of his sacrifices laid bare. The humiliation was no longer a private wound. It was public. It was undeniable. And it was only the beginning. The room held its breath. Guests stared at the binder of sacrifices spread across the table like a courtroom exhibit. Jenna's painted nails dug into her wine glass. His son sat stiff, lips pressed tight, as if willing the night to rewind. Max, however, felt strangely calm. The tremor in his hands had vanished. Years of being overlooked, brushed aside, labeled a burden, all of it had distilled into a single, unshakable resolve. He turned toward the fireplace at the far end of the dining room. A crackling fire had been burning all evening, meant to lend warmth to the Thanksgiving table. Now it would serve another purpose. Slowly, deliberately, Max picked up the binder and walked toward the hearth. The shuffle of his boots against the hardwood echoed louder than the murmurs around the table. Dad, what are you doing? His son demanded, half rising from his chair. Max didn't answer. He reached the fireplace, crouched slightly, and pulled one paper from its sleeve. It was yellowed around the edges, a mortgage statement from the early 2000s, when his back still ached from carrying cement bags and his knuckles bled from laying bricks in the Colorado cold. He held it up for everyone to see. This, he said clearly, was the price of your first home. Paid with my sweat, my blood, my missed holidays. Then, without flinching, he fed the paper into the flames. The fire caught quickly, curling the edges, blackening numbers and names, until nothing but ash remained. A gasp broke from one of the neighbors. Rosa covered her mouth with her hand. Max pulled another sheet. A tuition receipt. He read the line aloud, University of Colorado spring semester. $12.00. His voice grew stronger. I worked 3 jobs that year. Slept 4 hours a night. And for what to be told, I ruined the vibe. He dropped it into the fire. Sparks leapt, embers crackled. His son surged to his feet. Stop this madness, you're destroying everything. No, Max replied, locking eyes with him. I'm destroying your illusion. The illusion that I will always be your safety net, your quiet little bank account, your invisible foundation. He ripped another page free. A hospital bill, $150.00. The cost of bringing his grandson into the world. His grandson, who now played obliviously in the next room, laughter floating faintly through the tense silence. This one, Max said, holding it high, should have been my proudest gift. But instead it chained me to a family that erased me the moment I wasn't useful. He flung it into the flames. The paper hissed, black smoke curling upward. Jenna stood now, two-face-pale, voice sharp with panic. Max, think about what you're doing. Those are records. Proof you'll regret. This regret, Max's laugh was low, almost bitter, but there was steel in it. I regret only one thing, that it took me this long to stop giving to people who only take. Page after page went into the fire. The binder thinned, his burden lightened. Neighbors whispered, some nodding, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Finally, Max held the empty binder in both hands. He turned back to the table. His son and Jenna stood rigid faces, exposed under the weight of dozens of witnesses. Max's voice rang clear, stronger than it had been in years. I am free. The binder, now just leather and memory, followed the last receipt into the flames. The fire roared brighter, hotter, like it too had been waiting for this moment. For a long beat, no one moved. Then Mrs. Henderson, frail but fierce, began to clap. Slow, steady. Rosa joined her, tears shining on her cheeks. Pastor John followed, murmuring amen. Soon the whole room was filled with the sound of applause, not for the feast, not for the holiday, but for Max. For his courage. For his liberation. His son looked around, humiliated, searching for an ally among the guests. None met his eye. Jenna tugged at his sleeve, whispering something urgent, but he jerked away, face red with rage and shame. Max stood taller, the warmth of the fire brushing against his skin. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel like a burden. He felt like a man who had drawn a line and dared to step across it. The applause swelled, echoing against the walls, filling the empty spaces that once belonged to silence and loneliness. And in that moment, Max knew this wasn't just the end of something, it was the beginning. The fire crackled low, now its fury settling into a bed of glowing embers. But the echo of clapping still filled the room. Max stood motionless, breathing deep, the applause washing over him like a tide he had never thought to feel. Mrs. Henderson, standing nearest, reached for his arm. Her frail fingers trembled, but her voice was steady. Max, you should have done this years ago. Rosa wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve. He's right, she said, facing the others. You all saw it. You all heard his story. He gave them everything. And what did he get? A closed door. The guests murmured their agreement. Pastor John rose slowly, his white collar glinting in the firelight. This is not just a man reclaiming dignity. This is truth. Tonight we witnessed justice. Max's son, still standing by the table, looked like he wanted the ground to open beneath him. His jaw worked, but no words came. Jenna tugged at his sleeve again, her eyes darting toward the door, as though escape was the only option left. Dad, his son, finally spat the word, landing heavy with frustration. You've humiliated us? Max turned to him calmly. No, son. You humiliated yourself. All I did was hold up a mirror. Laughter rippled through the guests, not cruel but sharp, the kind that carried truth. His son flushed, scarlet fists tightening, but he stayed silent. There was no defense left to offer. One neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, raised his glass. To Max, he declared, "A man who built more than houses. He built this neighborhood. He built lives." Glasses clinked, voices joined, and suddenly the dinner that had begun in awkward silence became something else entirely, a celebration, not of turkey or stuffing, but of Max himself. For years, Max had imagined his funeral one day, who might come, what kind words might be spoken when he was no longer here to hear them. Tonight he realized he didn't need to wait for death to know what he meant to people. They were telling him now, while he was alive, while he could feel it. Across the room, his son sat down heavily, head in his hands. Jenna whispered something sharp in his ear, but he didn't respond. The eyes of the community were on him, every glance a reminder that his reputation had just collapsed. Max stepped forward, raising a hand gently to quiet the room. "I didn't do this to destroy my son," he said. His voice was even, though emotion quivered at its edges. "I did it to free myself. I was shackled by years of thinking love meant giving without limit. But true love doesn't erase someone. True love doesn't treat sacrifice as obligation." The room stilled, absorbing his words. Mrs. Henderson clutched her chest, whispering in. Max looked from face to face. The neighbors who had watched him fix their fences, shovel their driveways, and winter share tomatoes from his garden in the summer. These people had seen him at his strongest and his loneliest, and tonight they were with him. Not because of money, not because of obligation, but because they understood. His son tried one last attempt. "You'll regret this when you're alone, Dad. When no one's around to clap for you." Max shook his head slowly. "Look around, son. I am not alone." And indeed, the room had never felt so full. The applause rose again, louder this time, carrying with it a weight that no silence could smother. Max felt the sound settle into his bones, not as noise but as vindication. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the old man left behind. He felt like the center of the room, the man who had taken his story back. The fire popped one last time, shooting sparks up the chimney like fireworks. And in that glow, Max knew the night had shifted forever. By the next morning, the embers in Max's fireplace had cooled, but the fire he had lit in his community was still blazing. The whispers began before the sun rose fully over the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, who had gone home from Max's dinner with moist eyes and a proud heart, told her daughter over the phone. Her daughter told a co-worker, and by lunchtime half the congregation at Pastor John's church had heard the story how Max, the quiet widower who had built houses for a living, had stood in front of his son and daughter-in-law and burned the very papers that had chained him. At the local diner, Mr. Alvarez recounted every detail to his fishing buddies. He mimicked Max's calm voice, repeating the words that had silenced the room. "No, son. You humiliated yourself. All I did was hold up a mirror." The men slapped the table, shaking their heads, muttering, "Took guts to say that." By the time the waitress poured the next round of coffee, the tale had already grown. Some said Max had thrown the papers into the fire one by one, calling out each sacrifice, each bill he had paid. Others said Jenna had stormed out in tears, her heels clicking like gunfire against the floorboards. At the grocery store, shoppers leaned close over the produce section, their voices dropping to hushed tones. Can you believe it? After all he did for them, they left him alone on Thanksgiving. And then, poof, he burned the mortgage papers right in front of everyone. The butcher, overhearing as he wrapped up cuts of turkey, added, "About time someone stood up to ungrateful kids. My own brother-in-law could learn from that old man." By evening, even the high school students were buzzing. Someone's aunt had been there. Someone's grandmother had clapped until her palms turned red. The story spilled onto social media in vague posts. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is burn the chains holding you back. Another read, "Respect the people who built your life, or else you might end up like Max's son." Though names weren't always included, everyone in town knew exactly who was being talked about. Meanwhile, Max's son couldn't walk into his office without feeling the weight of stares. Co-workers, who once shook his hand, now gave curt nods, their eyes darting with judgment. A colleague leaned over during a meeting and whispered "heard" about Thanksgiving tough break. His face flushed crimson. He wanted to shout that people didn't know the whole story, but deep down he knew they did. The truth was simple and ugly. Jenna fared no better. At the hair salon, women gossiped openly, their voices carrying across the room as she sat in the chair. Imagine cutting out your husband's father like that. Who does that to family? One said, smirking. Jenna stiffened her knuckles wide around her phone but said nothing. And yet, while shame spread through his son's life like wildfire, something else bloomed quietly for Max. Rosa called him that evening, her voice soft but firm. Brother, do you realize what you did last night? You gave people courage. Mrs. Henderson told me she hasn't seen half the neighborhood that proud in years. Max sat by the window looking out at the fading light. For the first time in a long time, the silence in his house felt different, not heavy, but light. He sipped his coffee and listened to Rosa speak, letting her words wrap around him like a blanket. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was restoration. When he walked to church that Sunday, the whispers stopped as he entered, and then slowly, almost reverently, people clapped. Not the roaring applause of the night before, but a quiet, steady rhythm that filled the wooden pews with warmth. Pastor John embraced him at the altar. Max, you showed us that dignity is not given. It is claimed. Max lowered his head, humility softening the pride in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't asked for it. But here, it was respect, community, and belonging flowing back to him in ways his own son had refused to offer. And as the hymn began, Max finally allowed himself to breathe, knowing the story was no longer his alone. It was theirs too, a story of betrayal, but also of courage and the freedom that comes when a man takes his dignity back in front of the world. For 3 days after the Thanksgiving humiliation, Max's son could barely leave his house without feeling the burn of other people's eyes. At the gas station, a man pumping fuel gave a sarcastic nod and said under his breath, "Guess Daddy won't be bailing you out anymore." At work, his supervisor avoided assigning him key accounts. Whispers spread in hallways. That's the guy who let his dad eat alone while he feasted at the in-laws. He slammed doors at home, muttering that the whole town was against him. Jenna, though equally stung, tried to keep her composure. "If you stop acting so defensive, maybe this will blow over," she suggested. But when she went to the supermarket, and 2 women stopped mid-conversation as she walked by, she realized her husband wasn't exaggerating. Their reputation had sunk. At the office on Monday, Max's son attempted his own damage control. He arrived early, armed with excuses. To one coworker, he claimed Dad insisted on being alone. He's like that sometimes. To another, he sighed. It's complicated, you don't know the full story. But people weren't buying it. The humiliation had been too public, too precise. Everyone had seen Max stand tall, and everyone had seen him sink. That evening, he poured himself a drink, slamming the glass onto the table. "I can't take this anymore," he told Jenna, his voice raw. "Everywhere I go, I'm the guy who abandoned his father." Jenna sat stiffly, crossing her arms. Maybe if you hadn't left him with that turkey dinner, this wouldn't have happened. The words stung deeper than he expected. For the first time, he saw not just neighbors turning against him, but his own wife. "You were the one who wanted to go to your parents' house," he snapped. "You said my dad makes people uncomfortable. And you agreed," Jenna shot back. "You were so eager to fit into my family that you cut off your own." The silence afterward was heavy, a silence filled with mutual blame. The next day, he made a desperate decision. He drove across town to Max's small house, pulling into the driveway with the engine still running. The lights inside were warm silhouettes moving against the curtains. Rosa's car was parked out front, along with Mrs. Henderson's. The sight made his chest tighten. He knocked harder than he meant to his fist, echoing on the wood. When Max opened the door, his face calm and unreadable, his son blurted out, "Dad, can we talk?" The living room was crowded with people, neighbors, Rosa, Pastor John, who were sipping coffee and talking quietly. The atmosphere was thick with support for Max. His son felt outnumbered, judged before he even spoke. "Go ahead," Max said evenly. I just think everyone's misunderstanding what happened," his son stammered. "You know I care about you, Dad. Things just got complicated." Mrs. Henderson's eyes narrowed. Rosa folded her arms, lips pressed tight. Pastor John said nothing, but the silence spoke louder than words. Max finally set down his cup and looked at his son. Complicated, he repeated, his voice low but sharp. You left me alone on Thanksgiving. You knew it and you chose it. There's no misunderstanding. His son's face reddened. Dad, please. I'm begging you. Help me fix this. People at work, the neighbors, they're making me out to be some kind of monster. Max shook his head slowly. Son, I didn't make you into anything. You did that yourself. The words landed like blows. His son looked around the room, searching for sympathy, but found none. Every eye was steady firm. Maybe someday, Max said gently, though his tone was final, you'll understand what respect means. Until then, don't ask me to clean up your mess. The son's shoulders sagged. He left without finishing his drink, the door clicking shut behind him. Outside, the cold night air stung his cheeks, but the shame burned hotter. For Max, it was another step toward freedom. For his son, it was the beginning of desperation's spiral, scrambling for dignity, in a world where he had lost it in the worst way possible, publicly and irrevocably. 2 days after his humiliating visit to Max's living room, the son showed up again. This time he carried no arrogance, no loud voice. He parked his car, carefully turned off the engine, and sat in silence for a few minutes, rehearsing what he might say. He had never been good at apologies, but he knew he needed to try. Without his father's forgiveness, the whispers in town would never die down. Max, however, was expecting him. Rosa had called earlier that morning, saying she'd seen his son's car circling the neighborhood twice. Max wasn't surprised. Betrayal had a way of gnawing at the betrayer more than the betrayed. When the knock came, Max opened the door without a word. His son stood there, eyes tired, suit slightly wrinkled as if the past week had aged him. Daddy began softly. Can I come in? Max stepped aside. They sat in the kitchen, the same table where Max had once spread out mortgage papers and tuition bills to save his son from drowning. The air smelled faintly of coffee and wood polish, grounding Max in memories of a lifetime of sacrifice. The son clasped his hands tightly. I need to say this. I was wrong. I shouldn't have told you not to come to Thanksgiving. I shouldn't have left you alone. I thought I was protecting myself, but I see now how much I hurt you. His voice cracked on the last words, and for a brief second Max saw the boy he had once carried on his shoulders at county fairs, the boy who cried when he scraped his knee. But that boy had grown into a man who had chosen pride over loyalty. Max folded his arms. And why now? Why apologize now after the whole town has already seen what you did? The son's jaw tightened. Because I don't want to lose you, Dad. And because Jenna says if I don't make peace with you, things will just keep getting worse. Max's eyes sharpened. So, this isn't about me. It's about your reputation. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that peeled back every excuse. The son finally whispered, maybe both. I miss you, Dad. But I also need things to get better. I can't live like this with everyone looking at me like I'm less. Max leaned forward, his voice steady. You know what's worse than people thinking you're less being less? And the day you chose Jenna's family over me, the day you decided your father was an embarrassment, that was the day you made yourself less. The son's eyes filled with tears. Please, Dad, just tell people we're okay. If they hear it from you, they'll believe it. Max shook his head. You want me to patch the hole you dug? I won't do it. You taught everyone who you are. I just gave them proof. The son's composure cracked. His fists hit the table. You're supposed to be my father. You're supposed to help me when I stumble. Max didn't flinch. I carried you longer than I should have. Paid your debts, covered your mortgage, gave you holidays you didn't deserve. But this is a stumble you need to feel. Otherwise, you'll never learn. For a long moment, neither moved. The son's anger was raw, desperate, like a man drowning who still blamed the water. Max, calm and unyielding, felt the weight of finality in the air. Finally, the son stood abruptly, chair legs scraping the floor. Fine. If that's how it is, then don't expect me to come back again. Max looked at him squarely. That's your choice. But remember this, you walked away, not me. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the window panes. Max sat back in his chair, heart heavy but steady. There was no joy in rejecting his son's plea, but there was clarity. Forgiveness could not be bartered for reputation. It had to be earned through truth. Outside, the son walked quickly to his car, wiping his eyes before the neighbors could see. But deep down, he knew they already had. His desperation had only made the cracks in his armor more visible. 2 weeks passed after that bitter kitchen conversation. Max thought the storm might quiet down, that his son would lick his wounds in private. But pride, he realized, was a dangerous thing. Pride rarely dies quietly. It began with whispers in the grocery store. As Max reached for a bag of flour, he caught the hushed tone of 2 women behind him. They say he turned his back on his own son, one murmured. No wonder the boy doesn't visit. That man's too bitter. Max didn't flinch, but the words clung to him like frost. By the time he walked to the checkout counter, the cashier, a young man he'd known since boyhood, wouldn't quite meet his eyes. That evening, Rosa called in a fury. Max, have you heard what they're saying? Your son's telling people you refused to help him when he needed it most? That you've turned cold since Ellen died. Max tightened his grip on the phone. He's rewriting the story then. It's worse, Rosa continued. Jenna's telling her family that you've lost your mind, that you burned papers just to embarrass them, that you're unstable. For a moment, Max closed his eyes, breathing deeply to steady the fire inside him. He had expected resentment, perhaps even anger, but not a campaign to destroy his name. The next Sunday, the truth slapped him harder. At church, Pastor John gave a sermon on forgiveness, his eyes resting more than once on Max. And when service ended, fewer hands reached to shake his. Some eyes turned away entirely. By the time he stepped outside into the crisp winter air, Rosa was waiting by the steps. They're poisoning the well, she hissed. If you stay quiet, their version will become the only one people believe. Max nodded slowly. He had been raised to keep private matters private. But this was no longer private. His son and Jenna had dragged their feud into the public square, twisting the truth until it became unrecognizable. That evening, the phone rang again, this time Mrs. Henderson, his neighbor. Her voice trembled with indignation. Max, I didn't believe a word of it, but your son came to our house yesterday. Told Harold and me that you've been forgetting things, leaving the stove on, acting confused. He said they're only trying to keep you safe. Max's blood chilled. To undermine his credibility, they were painting him as senile. It was no longer about hurt feelings, it was about control and money and image. He looked around his living room at the framed mortgage receipts and tuition bills he had once saved. Proof of every sacrifice. Proof of his clarity. He realized then that the next move could not be silence. Rosa came over the following night, carrying her thick-rimmed glasses and a notepad. If they want a war of words, Max, then we'll fight with truth. You have the receipts, the bills, the canceled checks. Let's gather them. Let's make sure when you speak, no one can doubt you. Max spread the documents across the kitchen table, the same way he had once planned Ellen's funeral, with meticulous care. Tuition payments, mortgage checks, hospital bills, even receipts for the birthday parties he had covered when his son couldn't. I'll be damned, Rosa whispered, her eyes wide. You've carried them your whole life, and they called you a burden. Max nodded, his jaw set like stone. If they want to shame me, they'll do it in front of these papers, in front of the truth, and in front of everyone who matters. That night, Max began to draft a speech, not a rant, not a bitter defense, but a clear account of his life, his sacrifices, and his betrayal. Rosa edited each line, making sure it was sharp, steady, undeniable. For the first time in months, Max slept soundly. He had been painted as unstable, bitter, senile. Soon the community would hear the real story. And when they did, his son would no longer just be the boy who abandoned his father, he would be the man who tried to erase him and failed. Max had lived his life quietly. Even his sacrifices, double shifts at the construction site, the weekends spent pouring concrete instead of resting, had been quiet ones. He had never asked the world to notice. But betrayal has a way of forcing silence into sound. By midweek, Rosa found him sitting at the kitchen table with his notes spread across the wood surface, the overhead lamp casting a circle of yellow light. He wasn't staring at the papers anymore. He was staring past them as though seeing a stage only he could imagine. "It has to be public," he murmured. Rosa adjusted her glasses. "Public, yes. They've told everyone I'm senile, that I'm bitter, unstable. If I reveal the truth to just them, they'll twist it. But if I stand up in front of others with proof, then the lies collapse. I need witnesses, not just family. The whole community." Rosa hesitated. "Max, you've never liked crowds." He gave a thin smile. "I don't need to like them. I just need them to listen." That night, Max began making calls. First to Mrs. Henderson and her husband Harold, who lived next door. They had always been kind to him, often bringing over leftover pies or helping clear the snow from his driveway. "Max, of course, will come," Mrs. Henderson said firmly after hearing only part of his plan. "If what you're saying is true, people deserve to hear it." Next, he phoned Pastor John. The old pastor's voice carried a weight of concern. "Max, are you sure you want to do this, airing family troubles?" Max cut him off gently but firmly. "John, I've been painted as a confused old man. My own son tells the community I'm unstable. You've known me 30 years. You tell me, have I lost my mind?" The line was quiet for a long moment. Then came the pastor's reply, "No. No, Max, you have not. If you feel called to speak, then perhaps the truth itself is your sermon." By the time the calls ended, a dozen people had agreed to come. Some out of curiosity, some out of loyalty, but all promising to listen. Rosa busied herself with preparations, her energy sharp and efficient. "We'll call it a Thanksgiving follow-up," she said. "No one will suspect, just friends gathering for dinner. But when you stand up," she tapped the stack of receipts on the table, "that's when you lay it all bare." Max nodded. He imagined the scene, the long dining table filled not with silence, but with eyes watching, waiting. The chair his son should have occupied would remain empty, and that emptiness itself would speak volumes. For days, he rehearsed quietly in front of Ellen's photograph. "I gave everything. Tuition, mortgages, hospital bills, Christmases you never knew were paid with overtime shifts." And in return, his voice would catch, and he'd steady himself. "In return, I was told I was a burden." On the morning of the dinner, Max walked through the house arranging chairs, setting the dining table with the best china Ellen had loved. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air once more, though this time he wasn't cooking for his son's approval. He was cooking for his own closure. As the afternoon sun faded, the first guests arrived. Mrs. Henderson with a pecan pie. Pastor John carrying a bottle of sparkling cider. Old co-workers from the construction company, men who still bore scars on their hands from jobs Max had overseen. They shook his hand, clapped him on the back, saying how good it was to see him host again. Rosa watched from the kitchen doorway. "It's all set, Max. They're ready." And for the first time in months, Max felt steady. The lies had been spread in whispers. The truth would be spoken with a clear voice. Tonight, in front of witnesses, the story would no longer belong to his son's manipulation. It would belong to him. The table stretched long under the soft glow of the dining room chandelier. Candles flickered against polished glassware, and the turkey roasted in the kitchen gave off its rich golden scent. The hum of conversation filled the house, not with his family's voices, but with the friends and neighbors Max had invited. Mrs. Henderson was laughing softly with Harold near the fireplace. Pastor John leaned in to listen as Rosa poured him cider. A few of Max's old co-workers shared stories from job sites, long past their calloused hands, wrapped around glasses. For the first time in years, Max's house was alive with sound. Yet Max's eyes kept drifting back to the far end of the table. There, at the head, sat his own chair, and just beside it, the one that should have been occupied by his son. Empty. The sight cut like a knife. He had set the place deliberately, plate, silverware, napkin folded just so because he wanted everyone to see it. Not just a missing person, but a missing heart. A betrayal dressed in plain white linen. Rosa noticed his glance and touched his arm. "You don't have to stare at it, Max. People understand. I need them to see it, Max whispered back. His voice was steady, though his chest tightened. That chair says more than I ever could. As laughter and chatter continued around him, Max felt a strange duality. Warmth from the people who had shown up who valued him, and the cold shadow of the chair that remained untouched, accusing. Mrs. Henderson followed his gaze. She pursed her lips, then leaned to Harold. Can you imagine, she whispered, though not so quietly that others didn't hear. All those sacrifices, and he doesn't even show up. A murmur spread. Some nodded. Others shook their heads, frowning. The absence was louder than words. Pastor John lifted his glass. Max, you've gathered us here tonight. It feels right. Community. Fellowship. He hesitated, his eyes landing on the empty chair. But I know there's a story you'll be telling us soon. And we'll listen. The guests grew quiet. Forks paused, above plates. The air shifted, charged. Max rose slowly from his seat. His hand brushed Ellen's old chair as he stood, as though drawing strength from her memory. He placed both palms on the table, steadying himself, letting the silence deepen until every eye was on him, and every eye caught the sight of that untouched chair. I set a place, Max said finally, his voice carrying across the table. Not because I thought he'd come, but because I wanted you to see what I live with every holiday. A chair that never gets filled. No one spoke. Even the candles seemed to burn lower, as if bowing their heads. Max's throat tightened, but he pressed on. Tonight you're going to hear things I've never said aloud. And you're going to see why that chair is empty and why it will never be filled again. The murmurs stopped completely. Forks and knives were put down. It was as if the entire house inhaled at once, holding its breath. Max glanced once more at the chair. His jaw set. The time had come. Tomorrow, the story of his sacrifices and his revenge would echo louder than silence. The dining room had grown so quiet that Max could hear the faint ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Every guest sat, frozen eyes locked on him. The empty chair beside his was still untouched, like a wound carved into the evening. Max drew a long breath and walked slowly toward the mantel. On it rested a thick, weathered binder. Its edges were frayed, its pages swollen from years of handling. He lifted it with care, as if it were a relic from another life. I want to show you something, he began, his voice steady, but charged with emotion. He opened the binder and spread several pages on the table. These are receipts, bills, mortgage statements, proof of what I poured into my son's life. The papers fluttered as he laid them down, college tuition stubs, utility payments, mortgage installments. Each one bore dates, numbers, signatures. Each one was a silent testament to sacrifice. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, eyes widening. Max, you kept everything. I kept it because Ellen always told me you never know when you might need it, Max said softly. And tonight I finally do. He pulled out a page with faded ink. This is the tuition for 4 years at the University of Colorado. $48,000. I worked double shifts, pouring concrete, missing holidays, missing birthdays. All so my son could walk across that graduation stage debt-free. The room stirred, a low murmur rippling through the guests. Max flipped to another set of documents. This is the mortgage I paid for him. 20 years of payments, every month, without fail. My own retirement, my health, my back, all traded for a roof over his head. Do you know what he told me last week? Max's voice cracked, then sharpened. He said, don't come to Christmas. You'll ruin the vibe. Gasps filled the room. Rosa covered her mouth, tears welling. Pastor John shook his head in disbelief. Max's hand trembled slightly as he turned another page. And here, $3,000 for a car repair when Jeremy's BMW broke down. I cleared out my emergency fund to cover it. Not once did they offer to pay me back. Not once did they say thank you. The guests whispered fiercely among themselves, now voices full of outrage. Ungrateful, one muttered. Shameful, another hissed. Max let the silence settle again before he continued. He walked to the fireplace, the binder still in his hand. His shadow danced against the wall in the candlelight. For years, I thought keeping these papers meant keeping track of my duty as a father. Tonight I realized it was keeping track of my chains. He opened the fireplace screen. Flames flickered, crackling softly. Every page, he said, his voice rising, is a piece of me I gave away. Tonight, I'm taking myself back. With that, Max lifted the first page, a tuition receipt, and let it fall into the fire. The flames caught instantly, curling the paper into ash. One by one, he fed the fire. Mortgage statements, car bills, utility payments. The orange glow lit his face as though baptizing him in liberation. The room was silent save for the crackle of burning sacrifice. Guests leaned forward, eyes reflecting the fire as if they too were witnesses to something sacred. Mrs. Henderson stood suddenly, her voice breaking. You're right, Max. You gave them everything. And now you've given yourself freedom. The room erupted not in chaos, but in applause. The sound filled every corner of the house. People rose to their feet, clapping, some even crying. Max felt the weight in his chest ease like chains falling away. He looked at the empty chair one last time, then back to the flames. I'm not their wallet. I'm not their burden. I am a man who gave and who deserves better than silence at Christmas. The applause grew louder, echoing into the night. Rosa pressed through the crowd, embracing him tightly. You're not alone, Max. You've never been alone. And now everyone knows it. Max closed the fireplace screen, watching the last embers die into ash. For the first time in years, he felt warmth, not from obligation, but from dignity. He turned back to the guests. This is my last Christmas bound to their selfishness. From here on, I am free. And with that, the house thundered with cheers, the sound of justice finally delivered. The night after the fire in his hearth, Max thought sleep would come easily. He had poured years of silent suffering into those flames, and for the first time in decades he felt lighter. Yet when dawn crept through his curtains, the real weight of his actions settled in not regret, but anticipation. He knew the news would spread. In small towns, whispers move faster than winter winds. By mid-morning, Rosa called. Max, you have no idea. Half the congregation's talking about last night. They're calling you brave. Max chuckled, rubbing his temples. Brave or foolish, both Rosa said warmly. But sometimes that's the same thing. When he walked to the corner store later, the air felt different. Mrs. Patterson, who rarely spoke more than a polite hello, stopped him by the fruit stand. Max Hayes, she said, her voice quivering. You did what so many of us wish we had the courage to do. He blinked, unsure. What do you mean, my brother? He gives everything to his children. They treat him like an ATM. Last night, when people told me what you did, I thought finally someone stood up. She squeezed his arm. You're not just free. You've given the rest of us permission. Her words followed him out the door, heavier than any groceries he carried. By afternoon, Pastor John himself stopped by. The old man's wool coat was dusted with snow, and his eyes brimmed with a kind of pride Max hadn't seen in years. I heard about the fire, Pastor, John said, stepping inside. Heard you showed the whole town what sacrifice looks like and what betrayal costs. Max shrugged, embarrassed by the praise. I wasn't trying to start a sermon. You didn't, the pastor replied. You started a movement. That evening, Rosa called again, her voice buzzing with urgency. Max, you should know your son and Jenna showed up at the Hendersons. They tried to explain themselves. Beg people to believe you're exaggerating. Max closed his eyes, the faintest smile tugging at his lips, and Rosa's voice hardened. Nobody bought it. Everyone's seen the receipts, Max. You didn't just tell a story, you proved it. In living rooms across town, neighbors replayed every detail. They'd heard the bills stacked high, the tuition payments, the mortgage cleared by Max's sweat. People shook their heads, murmuring, how could a child do that? Others went further. Ungrateful brats. They'll never live this down. The following Sunday at church, Max sat quietly in the back pew. When service ended, he tried to slip out unseen. But the congregation turned one by one, clapping softly. A ripple of approval swelled until the whole room was on its feet. You did the right thing, Max, someone called. About time a father stopped letting himself be used, another said. He tried to wave them off, but their applause chased him out into the cold air. It wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the fact that for once the truth was not his burden to carry alone. It belonged to everyone now. Meanwhile, word reached his son. Friends stopped answering calls. A neighbor who once admired their shiny cars and parties now crossed the street to avoid them. At Jenna's workplace, whispers followed her down the hallway. Did you hear her father-in-law cut them off in front of everyone? Burned the bills. Said he was free. For Max, the humiliation of his son wasn't the goal, but it was inevitable. He had chosen truth over silence, dignity over servitude. And once the truth was spoken aloud, it could not be shoved back into the shadows. That night, sitting by his quiet fireplace, Max whispered to Ellen's photo on the mantel, they wanted me erased. But now they're the ones everyone sees for what they are. Outside, snow drifted softly onto Maple Street. And inside, Max realized that for the first time in years, his story no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to the town, to the neighbors, to everyone who'd ever felt the sting of giving too much. The verdict was in, and it was on his side. It was nearly a week after the fire when Max heard the knock. Slow, hesitant, not the pounding anger of someone ready for a fight. He opened the door to see his son standing there, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. Jenna hovered behind him, her face pale with sleepless nights. Dad, his son whispered. Please, can we talk for a long moment? Max only looked at them. He thought of the years of bills, the sacrifices measured in hours, work, the dinners alone, the holidays cold. He thought of the fire, the neighbors' applause, the way truth had finally burned brighter than his shame. What is there left to say? Max asked quietly. His son's eyes glistened. We didn't mean for it to go this far. We thought you'd always be there no matter what. That's the problem, Max said, his voice firm but steady. You never thought. You took. And you forgot who built the ground you stand on. Jenna tried to speak, but Max raised his hand. No, this is not your stage. This is my home. And I am done being erased. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the old clock Ellen once polished every Sunday. Finally, Max's son nodded slowly, as if the weight of humiliation had settled too deep to deny. They turned, walking back down the porch steps, their figures shrinking against the winter night. Max closed the door and exhaled. There was no triumph in his chest, no gloating laughter, just clarity, just freedom. That evening, Rosa and Mrs. Henderson joined him for supper. Pastor John stopped by with a loaf of warm bread. Around the table, laughter returned, small at first, but genuine. Family was not always blood. Sometimes it was the people who stayed when others turned away. Later, as snow began to fall outside, Max stood by the fireplace where the bills had burned to ash. He raised his glass softly toward Ellen's photo. We did it, love. They can't touch me anymore. I'm free. The flames flickered gently, not with fury this time, but with peace. And now, dear listeners, thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched you, if you felt the weight of sacrifice or the release of justice, I invite you to subscribe to the channel for more true-to-life stories of family betrayal and redemption. From my heart to yours, may your home be warm, your family be kind, and may you never be taken for granted. God bless you, and may you and your loved ones always find peace, health, and happiness.